Great. Well, welcome everybody to the first webinar in our Agile UX Masterclass for March. We've got Alyssa Briggs here, who's going to be talking about how to run lean experiments in an Agile team. So I will pass this over to her and she can introduce herself and we can go ahead and get started.
Thanks so much, Jerry. And as Jerry mentioned, I lead the design team at a company called PlaneGrid, and really excited to share more with you guys today about how we are using both a mix of Agile and lean experimentation to drive a lot of the work that we're doing. So just a quick note about PlaneGrid. For those of you who haven't heard of us, we make mobile apps for the construction industry. And basically, what we do is we put all of people's very many construction docs onto iPads or other mobile devices so that people can have them right at their fingertips when they're in the field building and actually collaborate with one another using our product. And what this does is it helps teams build faster and safer on the construction job site. And as you can probably imagine, that actually takes us to some pretty crazy places. In fact, just a week or two ago, I was actually standing at the top story of the new Salesforce building in San Francisco. It's about 55 stories tall. It is a massive 5-year project. This is actually a photo from the top of it. And this is actually what the 55th story looks like right now. As you can see, there are no walls. There's just a lot of construction equipment. Yes, that's a lot of water that you're seeing on the ground there. And that's because about 2 days before we were up here, there was actually a huge rainstorm in San Francisco. And there was something like 60-mile-per-hour winds whipping through this area. There was rain coming through, and construction continues 24 hours a day. It doesn't stop for bad weather in many cases. And so, yes, there were actually people up there on the 55th story in this pseudo-hurricane with their hard hats chained onto them so they wouldn't fly off, all their tools chained to them. And that includes their iPads, which were running PlaneGrid as well. So as you can probably imagine, if I am a construction worker at the top story of a building, pulling out my iPad to start using the PlaneGrid app is a pretty real challenge and not something we would necessarily see if we were in a user research lab watching them try out our newest workflow. And this isn't just a rare occurrence. People are using PlaneGrid in all sorts of crazy conditions and situations. Sometimes it's a rainstorm, but sometimes it's just bitterly cold outside and you're wearing these very thick gloves that might not have conductive material on them. Sometimes it's blazing hot and sunny and there's no shade anywhere. And so if you're trying to look at an iPad, you have this very serious, a lot of light reflecting off. It's very hard to see. So there are all sorts of conditions that our users are using our app in that we just cannot anticipate. And for the few scenarios I listed out here, there are hundreds and hundreds of more crazy adverse scenarios that our users are working within. And there's no way that we can actually go out and do deep research studies with all of our users in all of these adverse conditions. So what does that mean? I mean, that means from a design perspective and a product perspective, we do our best to understand the world of our users, to get out there, to really build that empathy and use that to anticipate where and how we build out new features and workflows. But at the same time, we can only do so much to evaluate this in a qualitative format. And so what we found to actually be really important is to rely not just on the qualitative feedback that we might get from the comfort of our research lab or while doing a remote moderated study from the comfort of one of our construction workers' offices. We actually need to look at real user behavior to see whether the things that we are designing actually even make sense and are actually working the way that they were intended. And the way that we do that is to run experiments. So what are experiments? Why should we use them? When I think about experiments, I mean, you have all actually probably run experiments before, either without realizing it on some of the product work that you're doing, or more likely you ran some experiments when you were in like the 4th grade in science class. And experiments, it's really sort of a scientific approach to learning. And what goes into an experiment is starting with an idea and then identifying all of the assumptions that underlie your idea, and then writing hypotheses and running an actual test that allows you to either validate or invalidate your assumptions. So it's actually a great way to approach science in general, but it's also a great way to approach designing and building products, because it allows you to explore a broad range of ideas very quickly and very cheaply, while also learning from real measurable customer behavior. And this, for my team at PlanGrid, that means we are often going out and deeply understanding the needs of our users, coming up with all sorts of new ideas, and then finding really quick and easy ways to test out whether those are the right ideas by actually seeing how quickly we can get them into our customers' hands in the wild, and then evaluate the data that we're getting back to see whether we made the right decisions. And that's not just something that applies to the construction space or for customers who are in adverse conditions. There's actually, I'm sure many of you have heard of Zappos, online shoe store. When Zappos was first getting started in 1999, they actually decided to use sort of a form of lean experimentation to even test out whether their business concept was viable. And so they actually built out the first version of the Zappos website and actually didn't hold any inventory, any shoe inventory. What they would do was wait for people to come in, use the website, purchase something, and they would actually run over to the local shoe store and then buy the shoes and then mail it to someone. And so it was actually a really clever way for them to test out whether the idea of an online shoe retailer such as themselves would be a viable business model. And within just a span of less than 10 years, they hit $1 billion in sales. So clearly experimentation worked out really well for them. In the past, I also used to lead a design team at Intuit, and we had quite a great culture of experimentation there. And I checked back with someone over there fairly recently, and she was saying that experiments now drive hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue every year, which is pretty amazing. And I was also leading design at a small political action startup. And while I was there, there was about a month where we were trying to drive an increase in new users. And within that month, we ran a series of experiments, about one every couple days. And we ended up driving a 7,000% increase in new users. I'm not making that number up, that really happened. So as you can probably see, this experimentation thing is really, really powerful stuff and really valuable for you to learn and try within your own teams. So let's actually dig in and learn how to do this whole experimentation thing. And I'm going to cover 3 things in here today. I'm going to start out by sharing how you can actually plan and run good experiments. Then we're going to talk about how to turn data into decisions. And then I'll talk about experimenting everywhere. So let's start here by digging in and learning how to run good experiments. So every good experiment starts with a challenge. And I recommend thinking about what's your problem and what is it that you're trying to achieve. So I wanted to just share a challenge that I've been having. This right here is a picture of our very, very sad coffee pot. And the reason that it is very sad is because somebody drank all the coffee and did not refill the coffee pot. This is a pretty typical occurrence. So how about we say our challenge is to get people to actually start refilling that coffee pot and run an experiment to see if we can get there. So to do that, I'm actually going to use this really handy tool that you can use to plan experiments, which I call the experiment grid. And here's what it looks like. What might look like a very simple worksheet is actually a really powerful way to plan, run, and track all your experiments with your team. And to illustrate how to use this, we're actually going to walk through each phase of this, from idea to assumptions to hypotheses to experiment and results, using our coffee pot experiment as an example. So we'll start out here with an idea. And now that we know our challenge, let's say we can just go ahead and brainstorm all types of crazy ideas about how we can improve coffee pot hygiene. And as you can see, I just brainstormed a couple here, and I thought maybe this one on the right, which is to put a note on the coffee pot, seemed like a promising idea. So I'm gonna just start here first. And if this idea doesn't work, I can come back and try some of these other ideas later on. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually start to think about assumptions. And assumptions is actually one of the trickier parts of experimenting, because it's really rare for us to actually sit down and ask ourselves, you know, what assumptions have I made about customers and the world that may or may not be true? And so one way you might want to think about this one is, if our idea actually works, what must have been true about customer behavior? So for our coffee pot example, there are a bunch of underlying assumptions. I am assuming people will even read a note. I'm assuming that they will have an emotional reaction to the note and feel some sort of sense of obligation. However, the biggest assumption that I'm making is that people are actually going to refill the coffee pot because of the note. So since this is my biggest assumption, I'm actually going to start here first. And what I'm going to do from here is actually turn my assumption into a hypothesis. And the way that we phrase a hypothesis is by using this format. If we do X, then Y% of people will do Z. And this structure here is actually very important, because what it means is you can actually either validate or fail to validate your hypothesis, which is very important for learning. So for our coffee pot example, let's just go ahead and translate our original assumption into hypothesis form. And what I'm going to write is, if I put a note in the coffee pot, then 75% of people will refill the coffee pot when it's empty. So when you're actually writing your hypothesis, you want to make sure that you choose something that has a little bit of logic behind it. You might want to use something like comparative benchmarking, or looking at how you're currently doing and just giving yourself a gut check of where you think you need to get to in order to feel successful. So in this case, let's say I had been keeping an eye on the coffee pot habits, and I'd been seeing the coffee pot only gets refilled about 20% of the time. And maybe I say to myself, you know what, I want to see if I can just get that to 75%, because, you know, it doesn't have to be 100% compliance, but if I can get it to 75%, I feel like that's been successful and I can go about my way. And we'll talk about in a little bit why it's so important that you actually do take a minute to pause and set a number that you really believe in and really want to strive for, because it's going to become important later when you are evaluating your experiment. So now that we've written our hypotheses, now it is time to actually figure out how to run our experiment. And your goal with your experiment should really be to choose the cheapest and fastest method that will allow you to validate your hypothesis. This is where you've probably seen books or articles about lean experiments, lean tests. There are a number of different tactics that you can actually use that allow you to gauge real customer behavior without having to, for example, build a lot of code or ship an entirely new product that you built from scratch. So I'm not going to dig into all of these. I have a little link at the bottom here that you guys can grab if you want to go get some more resources around this. But just do know there are many, many ways to structure and run lean, scrappy experiments. For our coffee pot experiment, it's actually going to be pretty easy to test this out, right? All I need to do is actually go and put a note up on the coffee pot. And then from there, I can use the metric by measuring what % of people who refill the coffee pot after finishing it. And through using this, I'll be able to figure out whether I validated my hypothesis or not. So conveniently, I found this very clever, snarky note online. So I actually printed it out, and you can see here I've taped it to my coffee maker. And so I'm going to just go ahead, I'm going to let this experiment run for a while, and then we'll come back later to talk about how we actually measure our results. So now, if you come back to the experiment grid, you can see we've actually gone through and filled this out together. We started out with our grand challenge, and then use that to brainstorm a bunch of ideas. We chose an idea and put it up at the top, and then we use that to identify what our key assumptions were and chose the biggest, riskiest one to test out first. Then we turned our assumption into a hypothesis using the format, if we do blank, then blank percent of people will do blank. And then we use that to structure and plan an experiment with a very clear methodology and metrics behind it. And we're going to keep this last box, the results box, empty until we've actually run our experiment and have some results to capture. So now let's talk about what happens after you run your experiment, when you are actually going ahead and measuring those results. I think the key here is that you actually need to make sure you don't just measure things and then say, okay, now I have a number. The key is you want to actually take that and turn that into learning, which you turn into decision making. So let's go out and actually start by collecting some data from our coffee experiment. So let's say, I actually had gone and put this note on the coffee maker. I actually, just side note, I did run this experiment, but as soon as I put that thing on, I walked away. 10 seconds later, I had to come back and remove it because it felt just too snarky for my office. But anyway, let's say I had gone ahead and run this experiment the whole way through, and I'd been sitting in the kitchen, keeping an eye on the coffee maker and seeing whether people are actually refilling the coffee pot. And here's what I found. Let's say on day one, I had 100% compliance. Everyone was filling that coffee pot. And even on day two, it was really, really high 90s. A lot of people refilling it. But then on day 3, day 4, and beyond, it actually started to taper down. And by day 5, it was actually back to about 20%, which was our initial state of coffee pot filling. Well, at that point, because the effect tapered off really quickly, I would actually say that this experiment failed to confirm my hypothesis. And I would actually go ahead and in the results column, track my results and say, look, the percentage of people who refilled it was initially great, but it dropped way below 75% after day 2. So this was not a success. However, at this point, I wouldn't just stop and feel bad about myself and feel like I'm bad at designing experiments or influencing human behavior. Instead, what I would say is, okay, I found this thing. I did not confirm my hypothesis. How do I actually turn this failure into an opportunity to learn? And in order to do that, you really have to start out by being super, super honest with yourself. It's so tempting when you run your first experiment and you don't actually confirm your hypothesis to say, oh, I hate experiments. I'm never going to use them. I'm bad at them, and just walk away from it and forget everything that happened. Or it's tempting to say, oh, I set my bar at 75%, but I really just should have set it at 22% because, oh, blah, blah. And you might make some excuse to yourself. But that is why earlier on when we were planning our experiment, it's so important to spend time actually planning the right experiment and thinking about what those metrics should be so that you don't allow yourself to cop out later on. And one of the reasons that's so important is because the next step of acknowledging that you have actually not confirmed your hypothesis is to ask yourself why. Why did we get the results that we got? And this is actually a great time to do some user research and actually speak with users who did or did not exhibit the desired behavior. And I don't mean you have to run some 3-month longitudinal study or ethnographic thing to deeply understand. No. All you need to do is just find a few customers who were in your test, give them a quick call or send them a quick survey or something, and just try to learn. And bonus points, of course, for bringing your team along and getting them closer to customers. This can be a great way to get engineers or product managers excited about actually coming out in the field with you or hopping on a customer call with you, because they realize that there is something behind the numbers and the data that is worth digging into. And then from there, hopefully you understand a little bit more about why, and now this gives you enough information to make a decision of some sort. And the decision is going to be super related to the experiment you ran and what you learned. So for example, in some cases, you might realize, wow, this idea that I tested was just a huge failure for some really cataclysmic reasons, and there's no way we could ever adjust or tweak this experiment to make it work, in which case, fine, throw it away and then go work on testing out a new idea. Or maybe what you'll find is there's actually some merit to this idea. There are some things that are going well about it, but it just needs another rev on the execution to bring it a little bit closer to fruition. In which case you might actually go back and run another experiment and just tweak a few variables to see if you can have a more positive impact from there. So let's take a look at our coffee experiment again. So here's a possible scenario. Let's say I go to some of the users who I saw had gone and gotten coffee and used it up and then not refilled it. I might ask them a few questions. And maybe what I find out is that initially people were entertained by the note, thought it was funny, it got their attention, and they wanted to refill it. But on day 3 and beyond, they started to think to themselves, wow, that note was really snarky and kind of offensive, and I actually don't want to refill the coffee pot now because I want to stick it to the man. So in that case, maybe what I learn is, there's some potential to this experiment, but what if I try making that note not so snarky? What if I make it actually a kind, pleasant, helpful note? So from here, we can actually run a new experiment using the same experiment grid, but we just put a new idea up at the top, which is to put a non-snarky note on the coffee pot. And maybe I keep my assumptions the same, and I keep my hypothesis the same, and my experiment methodology is even the same. But from here, I'll actually be able to run this again and see if my results stay the same or if they change. And from there, of course, once I measure, I can decide what to do at that point. So this is all well and good for our silly coffee pot example, but I actually want to give you an example of how you can actually do this sort of work in the wild. So one of the members of my team at PlaneGrid actually had this idea recently to create a daily email digest for users, which was actually something that many of our users have been asking for. So initially she was thinking, oh, I can just do all this design work and spend a couple weeks designing this, and then I can sit with our engineers and they can take a week and actually build this out. But then she had this idea of, wait, what if I just ran a scrappy lean experiment? So she ended up actually, in a very lightweight fashion, hand building and sending emails to a select group of users very manually, and had a methodology where she was expecting to hit a certain percentage of users viewing and clicking through and finding value in the email. But when she ran the experiment, she actually found that the usage wasn't as high as she expected. So she then ran a survey and did a few follow-up calls with recipients to investigate why. And after going through and really understanding what was and wasn't working, what she realized was there were actually some really core parts of other parts of the user experience that would need to change in order for this email to even be value to users. And so what she did decide to do was to actually throw out the idea for now, focus on some other things, and come back to this project later when a few other things had changed in the app. And what I think is so cool about this is that she actually did run a series of iterative experiments, tweaking little things, getting user feedback, trying to make it better and better, but then clearly got to a point where she was like, you know what? It is just not worth my time to invest in this. It is not worth our engineering's time to build this. Onward to the next idea. And I think that's really the power of experiments, is that it allows you to quickly and iteratively test things out, but then also figure out where are the most important places for me to focus my time and really get to bigger wins for both my company and for the user themselves. So if this sort of iterative learning building approach is sounding familiar to you, that might be because it has a lot of parallels with Agile. And in fact, I found the two to be very, very highly aligned. So this right here, this beautiful, beautiful chart, which I did not make, I just got this from this little URL down here, beautiful. This is your typical Agile development model, where you basically have the thing that you're building, and then over time, you do various iterations and you use learnings, lessons learned between each iteration to inform your next piece of work. And if we were to just go ahead and put some sweet new gradients on this, what we would find is that this is actually pretty much the same as your lean experiment model. And the difference is here being that you start out by just getting very aligned on your goal or your challenge, and then you run a series of experiments over time, and each lesson that you learn feeds into the next experiment. So just to give you more of a practical example of this, we have a growth team here at PlaneGrid, and one of the things that they've been working on is improving our onboarding experience, which they're measuring in terms of the duration of a new user's first session on PlanGrid. And so every sprint, they are basically launching a new experiment to a subset of new users. For example, in one sprint, maybe they're releasing a sample project that people can play with when they get into the app. And then in the next sprint, they're launching a video demo that loads up when you first try the app. And then in the third sprint, they have this new wizard that they're testing out that allows users to go through a multi-step workflow. Now, the key with this is that although they keep moving ahead and testing out new ideas, during each sprint, they're also going back and measuring data from previous sprints to figure out, okay, how is this going to affect things going forward? So just to track through what the life cycle of a sample project experiment might look like, it might be that we build out the sample project lightweight experiment in sprint 1. In sprint 2, we measure it and make a decision. And then maybe in sprint 4, we actually come back and do an iteration on the sample project to see if we can keep moving that idea forward and learning from it. So what's pretty cool about this is they're basically using an Agile methodology, but also carefully weaving in different pieces of experiments that they're running to keep up this real pulse of experimentation and learning throughout a whole year. So as you can see, when we can structure and measure the outcomes of experiments effectively, we're actually able to make smarter, better decisions along the way. So now you know how to plan and run experiments. You know how to turn your experiment data into decisions. And all of this leads us to the real secret of experimentations, which is that you can actually apply these everywhere. And as we talked about before, it's always about thinking through what kind of challenge am I trying to solve. So for you, maybe your challenge is increasing conversion on your website or reducing calls to customer support. Or maybe it's something internal, like building deep customer empathy across the company. I just wanted to share a little bit of a personal thing that myself and my team have been experimenting with, which is basically this grand internal challenge of how might we get design involved earlier in the product design and product definition process. So what we could have done to tackle this challenge is to just sit in a room and spend hours debating, what can we do, what can we do, how do we improve our culture, blah, blah, blah. But instead of doing that, we actually decided to run a series of experiments. So within about a 30-minute period, we put this question up on the board and just whiteboarded and discussed and brainstormed a bunch of different ideas about how we could do this. And then we actually picked a couple and decided to experiment with them. So here you can see one of my teammates was actually running an experiment to see what if we actually introduced this idea of the Google Design Sprint model and actually ran that with the team. And the way that they did this was to basically carve out five solid days for the team to jam together on a series of different things that would then ideally inform the direction of the product. And so he ended up running this experiment. It went really well from the sense that people were really engaged, they were excited, and the work that came out of it was really exciting and impactful. But there was also a problem that he noticed in behavior-wise, where a lot of times it would just be maybe a half or a third of the group attending various parts of the session, and not everyone, which of course had a negative impact in terms of the levels of buy-in and so on and so forth. And so what we did is we reflected on this and said, okay, we noticed this behavior, and he actually dug in and talked to members of the team to understand why was this happening and what could we do better next time to make it a more effective practice. And what they realized was that it was just incredibly hard for people to take 5 solid days, book up their calendars, and engage in this sort of activity, even though they saw the value of it. There was just the reality of interviews and all-hand meetings and all sorts of other logistics that people just couldn't get out of. So the team decided to run another experiment. And so the next time we were kicking off a project, actually tried, instead of a whole 5 days blocked out, having a couple of very time-boxed activities that would together and move pieces of the project forward. So here's a photo from one of our sessions, which was just last month, where we actually ran a 90-minute session to brainstorm and ideate and sketch around a brand new product feature that we were very on in exploring, and it went really, really well. We got great feedback. Really good things came out of it. But even then, we made sure to step back and say what went well about this, what didn't, and what will we iterate on the next time we do something like this. So that is an example of how you can really experiment everywhere. It doesn't have to just be things that you're doing within your product or within your design. It could really be things that are also cultural within your company, or maybe just in your personal life as well. So now we've really talked about 3 ways to experiment your way to success. We've talked about how to plan and run good experiments using the experiment grid. We've learned how to turn data into decisions and how to use Agile to build that ongoing cadence of building and learning. And we've also talked about experimenting everywhere, not just in your product. So when you get back to work, I encourage you to experiment with experiments. Think about a current challenge that you're facing. Maybe it's related to a current design challenge or even an interpersonal relationship. And then ask yourself, what assumptions am I making? What ideas do I have to help move this forward? How might I test this? And then pull out your handy experiment grid and take it all from there. So thank you all so much for your time. I've actually posted a copy of the experiment grid, which includes editable and printable versions at this URL. And I've also linked to some more materials you might want to read through on lean experiments to help you get started running your first experiment. And of course, if you are interested in experimenting with us at PlanGrid, we are hiring. So feel free to check us out and apply at the job link here. That's all I got. Thank you so much. I'd love to take some questions.
Great. Yeah. Fantastic job, Alyssa. And we've got actually a lot of great questions here. So let's just get straight to it here. While we do the Q&A, I will run a quick poll here. This is the same poll we run in every webinar, and it helps us collect information to make sure that what we produce in terms of events is aligned with what the audience cares about. So I will go ahead and launch the poll here. And just a 2-question poll, if everybody here wouldn't mind quickly filling that out. And yeah, let's get straight into the questions. We have some great ones here. So the first question is, and I think this is really relevant for your background, Alyssa, is how might you adapt the experiment grid for use in an enterprise setting? So in this case, the person works on enterprise applications and software as a service. Have you seen that there's tweaks to either the process or the experiment grid that are required in that setting?
Oh, that is such a great question. So I developed the experiment grid while working with some very smart experiment-minded folks at Intuit. And Intuit is, of course, an enterprise company. PlanGrid is as well. And what I found is that the experiment grid actually in some ways works better in an enterprise environment than sometimes in a startup. What I found is that at startups, sometimes people have this mentality of, I gotta move fast, I don't have time to fill in pieces of paper. Whereas in an enterprise context, what I found to work well is actually a little bit different types of teams working there and things like that, often coming in and saying like, look, here is a worksheet that other people at other enterprise companies are using really effectively. Would it be okay if we just gave it a go and just gave it a try once? And so I think within an environment and culture that's more enterprise focused, I've actually found that to work quite well. And then in terms of actually structuring the types of experiments that you're doing, this is really where it comes down to what you're trying to learn, how your company operates. One thing that I think is important to acknowledge with enterprise is sometimes it's difficult to run scrappy lean experiments with things like fake landing pages and all that, which might work more in a consumer environment. It can be a little bit tricky to do that when you have big, large clients that are paying a lot of money for what you're creating. But I think one of the things that I've actually found is there's also a secret benefit of working at an enterprise company, which is that you have customers who are very loyal to you, who want to give you a lot of feedback because they believe that their voice really matters to you, and you will want to make them happy. And you also have the superpower of a sales team who can actually go out and test stuff out for you. So just to give you an example of this, when I was at Intuit, I heard the story about this one team that they were basically working on this pretty big version of QuickBooks specifically meant for enterprise users. And there was this idea someone had that, hey, if we could actually offer a slightly lower tier of our enterprise pricing, we could actually capture a lot more users and continue to make a lot of revenue. And so this is like kind of a crazy idea. They actually brought it into their leadership team and pitched it and had some numbers, projections from their finance team and all that. But all the leadership looked at it and kind of just scoffed and said, no, there's no way. Enterprise means a company of this size and this price point, and no one would be interested in buying a lower tier. So rather than giving up, the team actually decided, you know what, we're going to run a quick experiment and just see if this idea has any merit. So what they did is they actually went over to one of their friends in sales and just said, hey, buddy, can you just help me out for just 1 hour on this one day? When people are calling into you and asking about different options and trying to purchase a certain version of this license, can you just mention to them that there is a lower tier thing, and they describe what the price point would be and the features involved, and just see if anyone wants it. So they actually ran the experiment, again, just for an hour, and what they found was that a bunch of customers actually really, really wanted that lower tier pricing, and were actually kind of disappointed when they found that they actually couldn't get it. And so they were able to take this information back to the leadership team and say, look, we ran the numbers, we looked at the trade-offs, and we actually have real customer behavior to back up the fact that it is worth us investigating this. And with that real customer behavior in tow, the execs actually started to take them seriously. The team actually ran a series of experiments after that got a little bit higher fidelity each time, and then ended up actually launching this new lower tier pricing thing, and actually now accounts for a huge part of that business unit's revenue, above and beyond any of the other little feature things that the leadership team had been advocating for in the past. So I think that's a great example of where within an enterprise context, you can really leverage the strengths that you have of your sales team and other functions around you to actually learn and grow, and see that as a strength rather than a weakness.
Right. That's a great point there, and that's actually a kind of a nice transition into the next question we have, which you touched on a little bit, but so in your experience, how would you recommend pitching the idea of running experiments and using the experiment grid to executives or management who may not be familiar with the design process or the value of experimentation?
Yeah, that is a great question. It really depends. I mean, the reality is pitching anything to leadership, it's just so dependent on your company and the leadership team and what resonates with them. So I would certainly start by asking yourself, first of all, is it important for me to pitch it to my execs? And if so, what have I seen work well in pitching things to execs? But I actually really recommend that you don't start that direction. I actually recommend you start from the bottom and just start running some little experiments with the team that you immediately work with. So I am a huge advocate for having this idea of experiment coaches, which is basically just anyone, it's hopefully you, dear audience, who decides, you know what, I'm going to be an experiment coach, and I'm going to just take some percentage of my time to just start running some experiments, with my own immediate working team. And over time, we will use the results and the things that we learn to evangelize and to teach people why this is important to do. So just to give you an example here, when I was at Brigade, the political social network startup that I mentioned earlier, I had a couple conversations here and there with our CEO, where I mentioned, we should run some experiments. We should maybe test some of these ideas out. And he was like, yeah, whatever. let's talk about something else. He just didn't really care. He didn't really care if we did it or if we didn't do it. But when we ended up actually with our cross-functional team, it was me, product manager, and a couple engineers actually designing a few experiments, running them, and then showing a 7,000% increase in new user signups. You better bet that caught the ear of the CEO. And he was like, what is this experiment thing? We should be doing more of this. So because I think it's the kind of thing where I can confidently say, once you get yourself in the habit of running a few experiments, you are absolutely going to have some positive results. Don't worry about selling it and to leadership or getting their approval. Just get out there and run a few little things and see what happens.
Right. Yeah, that's sort of been a common theme talking to designers who have worked in enterprise environments where sometimes it's just very small scale projects to get started, and then you kind of build your way up to that.
Yeah.
And the next question we have actually is about, let's see here. It is, I had it here for a second. Right, here we go. So somebody was curious about, ideally, how long does it take to complete a single experiment grid so that you're still lean and fast? So what might be like a useful duration to kind of time box your experiment into?
And is that for actually running the experiment, or is that for actually filling out the grid?
I would say it's probably more for running the experiment. If you've seen like a certain time box will work really well.
Yeah. Again, it really comes down to the experiment that you're running and what you're trying to learn and what level of precision you're looking for. For some of these experiments where you're doing an actual sit down, do an A/B test of two different versions of our landing page, I would encourage you to actually go sit down with an expert in this sort of thing and just figure out, given the number of users I have visiting this page every day and other various constraints, how long do I need to run this experiment for to get to statistical significance? But that's for a pretty directed A/B test kind of thing. If you're doing something that's a little bit more of a just like a lean test, like, hey, I want to see if I can, what would be a good example? Is something like looking for product market fit and testing out, like, what if I run almost like a Wizard of Oz approach to some sort of thing, like the Zappos experience, right? Like they might have a different time scale that they're looking at there. They might be looking at, just testing something out that needs to run for a couple months to see if it works. Or maybe they're running smaller experiments that just within a couple hours they can see. One thing that was very inspiring to me was when I was at Intuit, there was this actual experimentation jam thing that happened, which within a 24-hour period, hundreds of people across the company got together and ran various experiments and tested out various ideas. And this was about a 24-hour jam. And so that meant within 24 hours, all these people had run something like maybe 2 rounds of experiments, maybe 3 in some cases, and learned from them and gone through and done the next iteration and learned a ton along the way. And that was using things like, fake landing pages with Facebook ads driving to them to just get, a burst of views and check click-through rates and stuff like that. Or it might be things like emails and seeing who opens up which emails and how they respond. So it really just comes down to the experiment you're trying to run and what it is that you're trying to learn and to what fidelity.
Gotcha. And actually the next question again kind of goes back into timelines and getting buy-in. So this, I think, is actually a really relevant question, which is, how do you get developers or product or even project managers to buy into these small experiments if they might impact the deadline or the budget of a project? Have there been like useful tactics that you tried in the past to kind of get that sort of Scrum team together and bought into this as an idea?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question and very near and dear to my heart. Because again, when I think about this whole idea of experiment coaches and people who've dedicated themselves to championing experiments, that's one of the first things they ask is, how do I get my team on board? So I think a lot of it comes um, down to just making the idea of experimenting seem really, really, really lightweight and really easy, and putting that in contrast with um, very expensive things like doing a big design push and then building something out. So that was sort of where the example I shared earlier of my teammate who was testing out this idea of like email updates to users about certain things. One of the reasons that the team was excited about that, and she didn't do that herself. She actually got a product manager and she had to also get some data scientists and other people on board with her to help her run that test. And the way she did that was by saying, look, we've got this thing here, and if we want to actually build it out for real, it's probably going to take X many days for me to do the design work. And it's going to, she talked with an engineer who said, yeah, that's going to be like 2 weeks of development work plus. And so she basically said to the team, look, we could actually go ahead, take a leap here and actually build out the entire thing, do all the design work. And that's going to take us, 4 weeks. Or I could just sit down with y'all and then run this experiment test in about 2 hours, and then we'll see where we can get. And when a team is looking at it from that frame of reference, it becomes really obvious that you should just run the scrappy experiment rather than over-investing in something. And I think that's actually a really common thing that you'll see just in general is engineers hate it when they have to go and build something and it turns out they built the wrong thing and they have to come back and rebuild it. Like, they just hate that. And it's the same with product managers. They don't want to have to be leading this product and waste all this time just look at something that doesn't actually deliver good benefits at the end of the day. So if you can frame experimentation in those terms of saving time and helping the team focus on the most important things, the most efficient way possible, I think it's actually pretty easy to sell.
Gotcha. And actually, this next question is related to that the question about buy-in, which is, so let's say once you've got the team bought in, how do you go about choosing the product problems that you want to experiment with? Is there some sort of framework that you have found useful for prioritizing?
Yeah, actually, I think in many ways, getting people bought in on the first practical experiment is more important than getting them bought in on the idea of the experiment. And what I mean by that is, I hope after this session, you're able to share this video or share these ideas with your team and them just generally be like, oh yeah, head nod, that makes sense. We should do that. But what would actually be way more impactful is if you walked into your team and you were listening and you saw, ooh, here's this big scary assumption the entire team is making that no one sees but me, and I'm going to call it out right now, and I'm going to say to my team, guys, it looks like we're making this assumption, and I don't think we should have, I don't feel confident in this. And you know what if we just ran a super lightweight experiment to just test it out? I can tell you right now, if you do the latter, you are going to just have people so much more interested and excited about experimenting than actually just kind of selling them on this general idea of experiments. And then when it comes to choosing that actual product problem that you are focused on, I mean, that really comes down to just, being able to look at the assumptions and things that people are saying and ask yourself, does that make sense? Do I agree with that? Is it something that we are actually basing off of something we have learned in the past, or is this just a bunch of assumptions that people are making together?
Right. And actually, speaking of developing the assumptions and the hypothesis and the overall experiment, in your experience, what team members should be involved in that process in the very beginning when you're trying to define the experiment and all of the details around it? Is it enough just for the designer to create that, or have you usually done it as a team exercise with other folks, giving them?
Actually, yeah, great question. I actually think it's incredibly important to do this work together with your team. One of the reasons that the experiment grid is so useful is because it's the type of thing you could print out really large, put up on a whiteboard and then actually facilitate your team going through the experiment grid and filling it out together. I didn't spend a ton of time talking about today design facilitation and using the experiment grid as a tool, but I've personally found it to be a great way to actually get your cross-functional team in a room for, I don't know, don't ask for a ton of time, maybe just 30 minutes, and bring a bunch of Post-its and Sharpies with you, and then actually work through planning the experiment together. So what you can do is, with the idea part, for example, that one's easy. I'm sure you've all run brainstorms before where you guys are just coming up with tons and tons of ideas. But from there, you can use something like a 2x2 grid, 2x2 prioritization matrix to actually choose, hey, which idea do we think we want to start out testing first? And then you just take that Post-it and boom, you stick it right on your experiment grid sheet. And then for assumptions, you can do a similar thing. You can have everyone scratch their heads for a while and say, look, for this idea to work, what assumptions would we have made that need to be proven true? And then again, go through Post-it note, brainstorm, vote on what you think is the most important to assumption to vet first. Boom, you put that on your experiment grid. And you can really do that going throughout the whole grid. It doesn't take very long at all. I've done this with teams, and we've gone ahead and just spent 30 minutes to an hour jamming on a bunch of different ideas and assumptions. And then we've used that to run series of experiments that, once you've sort of thought through it for one idea, each subsequent experiment that builds on it can go a little bit quicker. So I actually think this is a really useful tool to use with your teams, and I would urge and encourage you to do that rather than trying to just do this by yourself.
Right. And the next question we have actually is again around sort of timing of the experiments. So when you go and complete this experiment grid, do you generally do that before you've conducted the user research or after the user research? Maybe you could illuminate a little bit on where this kind of fits into that time.
Yeah, I think it can be used in many different places. What I found is that some level of exploratory and generative user research is helpful to help you understand what the grand challenge is, and also to help you come up with really good, exciting ideas. And then you can go ahead and from that point, plan out your experiments, run some experiments. But you also want to make sure that you have research kind of queued up between each experiment for some of that follow-up learning that I mentioned. So when you actually run that experiment and you get the data back that, ooh, we did not increase conversion quite as much as we were hoping, being able to quickly get on the phone with some users and dig into the why behind it is really important to help you then plan that next experiment.
Gotcha. And let's see here. All right, so the next question is more around organization. So how do you actually track all these experiments that you're running? For instance, do you just have a folder with a lot of experiment grids that are completed in there? How is that stored and circulated among the team?
Yeah. So actually, I've seen this work well in a couple different ways. When I was at Intuit and personally running a bunch of experiments with a team, one thing that we did is we liked having physical artifacts, and we had sort of a war room in our office. And so what we did is for each experiment that we were running, we actually had a physical version of the experiment grid tacked up on the wall, and we kind of taped them along the wall in chronological order. And then when we went back and did our looking at our metrics and evaluating our results, we would actually take the printout of the results and tape it to the bottom of the grid. So we had this physical artifact that we could come in and check at any time. At PlanGrid right now, our team is actually using a Google spreadsheet that everyone has access to, where each experiment that's being run is slotted in there, and there's columns that are tracking things like a link to the image file that shows what is up there, a screenshot. It tracks stuff like when are we planning to come back and measure this? For things that have already been completed, did it validate or invalidate the hypothesis? And so they don't have like a literal physical experiment grid that they're using, but all of the same types of data that we're looking for are captured in there.
Right. Yeah, I could see how it'd be pretty straightforward, where you could convert this into like a Google spreadsheet where each part of the quadrant is just a column, and then that way you could kind of consolidate and organize and also just share all your experiments in like one document with everybody.
Exactly.
Gotcha. And the next question is actually pretty interesting. It's kind of on the other side of the experiments, which is, so when you have encountered an experiment that failed, how have you sort of framed that or presented it so that it kind of wasn't perceived as just a total kind of waste of time, right? So this person works in an agency where he's curious, if an experiment fails, how would he present that to a client so that he doesn't lose the budget to run those experiments?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, I haven't really thought about that from an agency context, but what I've certainly done from an in-house context is to reframe it all around learning, right? So I think that's why it's so important when you look at your results and you see you did not hit your you did not validate your hypothesis, to quickly bounce back and say, okay, well, that happened, but let's go figure out why, right? I think one of the things that you often find is that when you go in and you start measuring your information and then you go and ask why, you will often find something you just never expected to be the case in the first place. And it's the type of thing where, I think this is where it's so important to run experiments versus just kind of work in this waterfall way where it's like, I know what I need to build, I know what the winning idea is, and just go ahead and build that and then fail 6 months later. Instead, I think it's awesome to be able to say, look, we had the option to just go build this monolith and not test out any hypotheses. But within the span of just 2 days, we were able to learn that this was a stupid feature to build, or like this was a really, really idiotic note to put on our coffee pot, if you're able to talk about it as like, wow, look how fast we learned. And wow, look at this really, really interesting thing we learned about our users that we didn't know before. And wow, here's the next thing we're going to test out, which is going to help us move forward. I think people start to see experiments not as a waste of time, but as something that has just saved you 6 months of wasted time.
Right. Yeah. In that case, it's like, even if the experiment itself fails, the idea hasn't failed because, like you said, you've maybe invested a few hours of time to save hundreds down the line from, it's kind of the
That's right.
opportunity cost of avoiding the wrong idea.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think there's a lot of parallels just to things like usability testing, right? Like yes, usability testing takes time, it costs money, but the reason that we do it is because we know that for every hour we spend on usability testing, we've probably saved ourselves hundreds of hours of having to redesign and rebuild that down the line.
Right. And actually, the last question that we'll take here, since we are coming up on the hour, will be around how you sort of resource for this. So how have you balanced time for running experiments versus working on new features? So on a team, for instance, do you try to dedicate, I don't know, let's say like 15% of the time to experimentation and 85% for your regular sort of feature and product work? Just be curious to get your thoughts on that.
It's so interesting how that question's phrased, because I can hear within it an implicit assumption that experiments are different from product design and product development. And in my mind, I actually see them as a really important thing that is all together, which is answering this question of how do we build and design and ship the best product, right? So we at PlanGrid have a specific growth team, which their charter is to just run little scrappy experiments all across our products. So in that sense, yes, we do have people whose full-time job it is to run scrappy experiments. So I guess I'm a little bit of a hypocrite saying that, but really within all of our product teams where we have designers, product managers, and engineers working together, every time they are showing here's this new thing we want.
Oh, Alyssa, you cut out there for a second. Hold on.
use the full extent of their toolkit, be it usability testing, generative user research, experiments, or any other technique to really build greater confidence in the work that they are planning to design and then deliver. So in that sense, it's really, it's not that it's product development versus experimentation. It's product development, and experimentation is just another tool in the toolbox.
Right. Yeah, that's a great way to sort of frame the whole concept here. As you know, for people that are listening in, it's not like two separate things, right? They have to be integrated with each other. It's basically experimentation is a form and like part of the product development process.
That's right.
Got it. And let's see here. Great. So that's the last question that we'll take there. And as a reminder to everybody, if you would like to continue the conversation, we have a Slack group here called Product Tribes. And if you have more than 3 years of experience in a product team, we encourage you to apply here. So this is an invite-only group that I dropped the link there. We've got about 3,000 designers, developers, and product managers there. Otherwise, Alyssa, you did a great job here today. Thanks so much for your time. Everybody here really enjoyed your presentation and the great answers you were able to provide afterwards.
Great, and thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I saw there are many people dialing in from many different countries as well, so thank you so much for making the time. And if you have any follow-up questions, I'll be in that Slack group. You feel free to message me there, or you can hit me up on Twitter. My Twitter handle is down in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Thanks so much, and I hope you will all go out and run your very first experiment over the next couple days.
Great. Yep. Thanks, Alyssa, and thanks everybody here for listening in. Next Wednesday at the same time, 10 a.m. Pacific, we have Laura Klein with us, who's going to be talking about how she uses data in the product development process. And hopefully we'll see you there as well. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, guys. Take care.